Hello, I am talking today about the Stormbowl cult in the setting of Glorantha, and it's certainly not something I want to be this big authority about, but it's really relevant to this discussion at Adept Play. And shockingly, I actually think I might say something that's relevant to the person who's running RuneQuest in Glorantha, the latest version of the game, who has sort of jumped in with both feet into Glorantha stuff and is using source material from a number of different games. And then we have somebody who's interested, who's not familiar with that material at all, but is real interested in the setup of situations, particularly as cult membership and the associated rules apply. So let's see what I can say about Stormbowl that may be helpful to both, if possible. It goes back to the late 70s when one may be holding the book RuneQuest. Some people call that RQ2, but really it's the first, serious playable version of the game. And then you have this new supplement, very shiny, just came out, Cults of Prax. Now, what one might say is, but the setting was already in place with the board games, Nomad Gods and White Bear, Red Moon, and kind of. There's a lot of changes. I mean, the enormous things about if you read those board games and say, okay, I have my setting, and then you go to Glorantha as presented even now, just a few years later in this book, you've ported the maps in, but there's a lot of difference. So I'm just saying, never mind those. We're looking at this and saying, okay, you got a dope out role-playing setting from this somewhat there's big timelines in there, but, kind of scratching your head over what this is. So looking at it, going by the cults in Cults of Prax, we learned from the core book that there was a cult called Orlanth Adventurous, which is kind of ready-made for a wander the earth and learn what you can and have a good time player character. Things get a little more geographic, a little more overall cultural when you look at Cults of Prax, which is set in the Nomad Gods area, which is basically a wasteland with, various tribes riding around on various animals. And the important thing is that you have the local gods, the culture of the area. So cult here really means of the culture. And they're very tribal. There's the sort of hunter, meat manager, leaderish kind of cult. Aha. There's the very ancient cult, which is about spirits and death, which even the baboons follow. And then that's Dakafal. And then you have the cow mother, the herd mother, all horns and boobs. And that's Aretha. And then there's this other one called Stormbowl, which is considered to be part of the tribal gods array. But he's very much an outsider. And if you want to be kind of the guy who doesn't have to do what the tribal head says, and your mission is to fight chaos, right, above the differing needs of different tribes or kin relationships and stuff like that, and you want to do that kind of thing, then you are, Stormbowl's your guy. In role player terms, it's broken. It's way overpowered. I mean, the Berserk rules, you've got this sense chaos ability, right? So, and you've got this sort of moral mandate to just kill it. You've got no relationship to chaos except, exterminate. So that means that playing the character is very easy, right? You put out your little radar, sense chaos thing, and you see some, and you're like, rah, go berserk and hack at it with your axe, and everybody better just stay out of your way. So it completely overrides any other consideration of play. It's very much a takeover, excuse me, this comic is all about Wolverine, kind of attitude. Now, okay, that's sort of the worst of it. They're playable, right? Everybody is playable in this game when you get into what's going on and so on. But you can really see how play can gravitate, or players can gravitate toward it. And then once they do, play has to do the same. And it's easy to kind of, someone's trying to explain, well, 500 years ago, then the Penton nomads, and you're like, I'm playing the Storm Bowl. It's cuts through, no pun intended, a lot of dithering. There are other gods available in Cults of Prax, which are very much visiting. They're present not because they have a long history of tribal worship and observance, but because other cultures are active in the region, and there are other communities and temples or priests of them are about. One of those is what we saw in the core book, Orlanth Adventurous. And again, available not because widespread cultural understanding of Orlanth is a big deal, but because Orlanth adventurers have been here and, have some influence in the region on an individual priestly basis. So one would imagine that, a tribal guy would say, these fancy dressed foreigners, have been around for a while and they're not so bad. And I want to go worship over there, thanks tribe. And that's that. But there's a connection. We find that Stormbull is not just a Praxian nomad god, but that he's actually a brother to Orlanth. So he's part of that mythology. Oh, so this is great. Stormbull becomes a much more attractive choice because not only is he recognized and understood by all the tribal peoples, but he's also mythologically connected to this sort of larger scheme of metaphysics and history and mythology that Orlanth is central to. And that you're kind of like, oh, that's kind of fun, right? If I'm playing Stormbull, then I'm good with the tribal people and I'm good with, the Orlanthi, and this is, that's awesome. Anybody who is looking into sort of more backstory-ish Glorantha stuff at this time, whether you're reading the magazine, probably the Worm's Footprints and Footnotes. It's had different names, but anyway, if you're reading the zine of the time, or involved in that Gloranthan-ish culture of discussion that has sprung up through a variety of other sources, then you would be all into, a whole bunch of other mythology that sort of explains these connections and whatnot. But just looking at these two books and going by them, the idea, okay, I want to play the berserker. I want to play the badass. I want to play the guy who doesn't have to listen to anybody, and who also happens to be, the combat monster of the bunch. I'm playing this guy. Things become a little more interesting with the second supplement, which arrives very quickly, 1981, with Cults of Terror. And one of the interesting points about it is that the setting is considerably shifted away from Prax. And the somewhat simplistic notion that you have evil, bad, crawling chaos, and then you have the sort of subverted and sneaky, deceptive, always hypocritical, always exploitative, lunars who, are made good with chaos, and so now they stink, right? They're bad people. And then your heroic consortium of Praxian nomads and Orlanthi-ish worshippers, Lightbringer worshippers, basically from all over, standing firm against them. You can kind of get that impression from the core book plus Cults of Prax, just looking kind of at it as basic options of play. Then when you go to Cults of Terror, a bunch of things in those other sources start looking a lot more interesting. For example, the Cult of the Seven Mothers, which is lunar associated, you could easily have gotten the idea that they're just a bunch of deluded, at best, idealists who are working for evil people. Or you can look at them now with certain more perspective from Cults of Terror and go, oh, actually, I think these guys are making a lot more sense. It's a lot more nuanced, thinking people's cults, right? Not just reactionaries. So the story that tracks through Cults of Terror, both of these books have their own individual story that you read through in sections. They're both quite good. The one in Cults of Prax, though, is very much from a worshipper of one of the Lightbringer cults and regards Orlanth as sort of, the king of the gods. In Cults of Terror, the narrator, the writing person, the first person writer, is actually a lunar advisor, a scholar, who's working with Orlanth worshippers or worshippers of that pantheon who have a fairly reasonably treaty-based relationship with the Lunar Empire. The problem is that they're dealing with a particularly grotesque and horrifying outbreak of raw chaos, and the Lunars are all about helping them out. And so you have a very much more nuanced set of characters interacting with different opinions through this story. And significantly, the major player, arguably the protagonist that the scholar is merely observing, is a Stormbolt worshipper. And this has nothing to do with Prax and the tribes. This is somebody in this region. And we're seeing Stormbolt as a member of an area that has, for lack of a better word, laws. And we're also seeing that character actually gains a mystic understanding that transcends the boundaries or the perceived opposition of chaos and non-chaos. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, this story is all about exploding the assumptions. So at that point, you're kind of going, first of all, the Stormbolt worshippers are somewhat more completely described in action, and it's problematic. I mean, their fanaticism is necessary or useful in the position of these outbreaks, but it's kind of implied that they're not that safe to have around. They're not really the linchpin of society that, that to have Stormbolt worshippers just around socially isn't really, kind of makes you swallow a little bit and say, does that guy have to be in charge? Right? So armed with these 3 books, one looks across and says, there's some weight here in what to do with Stormbolt already. I mean, he's an unusual god in that he's clearly marginal. Nobody but bikers, basically, worship Stormbolt. And that's not quite true. Some of them, like rise high in ranks, but the reason that this one guy in that story is well regarded and is chieftain level is because he's the brother of the Orlanth worshipper, who's kind of the big chief of chiefs in that region. So you're kind of going, yeah, without some sort of mitigating structure. I mean, the interaction of Stormbolt with the healer goddess of the Lightbringers really kind of softens them down. You've got kind of always have this duo, right? This hulking, scratching Harry. Where's Chaos? Fuck Chaos. I'm going to kill it. Are you Chaos? Rah! Right? And then this healer woman who accompanies them, kind of in their little, her hood and her quietness and her pacifistic ways. And, and what she does is, calm. She has calming magic to calm down the berserker rages. And so you get the idea that you have a lot of these duos going around, or teams of healers and berserkers. With all this in mind, then we move to the subsequent decades of scribbling. And then from the subsequent decade of scribbling, then we have the decades of, my way. Glorantha works like this. I publish a supplement. It says so, right? Pounding away on the internet. And if one turns, which the modern Glorantha game, the RuneQuest game, doesn't, but if one turns, as this particular playgroup has, to a lot of the source material for Hero Wars / HeroQuest, there you really have much more of a focus on how these very player character friendly cults from the old days, Humact and Stormbolt in particular, when you look at them more socially and sort of have much more elaborate rules of the rings, the concentric rings of a given cult and how they relate to society, which was pretty good in Cults of Prax, especially for a role-playing game of that era. It's remarkable. But here in the material for Hero Wars was pretty sophisticated. It becomes immediately clear that Stormbolt worshippers, as well as the Humanity, are very marginal people. I mean, if it weren't for their utility against chaos incursions and stuff like that, they would be considered outlaws. It would be basically considered an outlaw cult, a way to worship when you've been thrown out because you cannot get along. And they're called Uroks by this point. All of the gods have gained, funky names by this point. And it's quite, up to a given group how to interpret this in terms of play and what to do about it. When I played a fair amount of Hero Wars, I had a thoughtful Stormbolt worshipper as an NPC, and partly that was influenced by my enjoyment of Cults of Terror. But that didn't stop him from being a freaking menace. And for, if he showed up, the community locked its doors, and somebody bold would come out and try and get him out of there, feed him something and, have him go away. And that's kind of what we're seeing is in this game is a mix of these influences as they may have impacted into the rules of the current game, where to some extent it's the new rules which are imported from Pendragon with traits and passions, and then the affinities of the runes which is imported from Hero Wars / HeroQuest, all of which play a big role of putting some mechanical weight into the mysticism of the setting, but also introducing involuntary activity. That, you roll this way and, man, that passion or that rune just, or that aspect of the rune in particular just kicks in, your eyes cross, and you're doing that. You are, to a great extent, especially for Stormbolt, you are seized by the god, you're in an ecstatic or, state, and it's going to be, a frenzy. And that kind of rule had not existed in any version of the game to date, and having that in RuneQuest now really puts some teeth into playing, a Stormbolt character. Add to that the current game master's interest in that Hero Wars material, which really focused a lot on the cultural context of each cult, to the extent of taking cults that in the past had seemed quite ideal for, an adventurer, and then saying, well, yeah, but adventurers don't do real well, at home. So, you're now the Humanity, instead of just being kind of cool samurai goths, are, fucking suicide cult weirdos, right? And so the Stormbolts, come off as much more dangerous and problematic as, it's fine if you're running off to go, kill a bunch of brew for, an adventure. Not so much fine if you're trying to play a character in a setting with a culture and with, one wonders, what kind of future. So given the formal scope of play in the current game, and given the mechanics that have been ported in, and then given this really interesting, not nuanced in concept, developing and changing in concept, and then nuanced in concept in the sense of belonging, to more than one pantheon in different ways, or observed in different ways in different cultures. And then finally, kind of nuanced in terms of player interest in playing, right? And you say, I want to play the badass fighter. Oh, you can play a Stormbolt guy. Well, now you're going to be landed with something that you're like, wait a minute. If that's what it takes to be the badass fighter, I'm not so sure. Maybe I want to be a more rounded kind of character who actually could get married someday, or could, actually sit down and have lunch with somebody successfully. It's kind of interesting. You import Pendragon style stuff, which is very much out of Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, where the knights are kind of bonkers, right? They go off half-cocked in according to their various, conflicting values and the almost impossibility of actually being chivalrous, and they snap. Lancelot kills people at random. Other people go just fixate on some vengeance thing, and other people, fixate on God and go, crazy off toward, living half in a mystical realm. You import that stuff over to Glorantha, and you're starting to get some playability phenomena, not issues, but phenomena, that now you look back on the history of the Gloranthan material and you're like, if we're going to play it that way, this is going to be a different kind of day, right? So I think we're looking at that, and very much not as a problem, but with a really interesting history throughout the course of role playing.